Hi, everyone. I'm Stacy Pendarvis, and on behalf of the entire MBF team, I'd like to welcome you to Let's Talk About Prevention, our continuing webinar series. And if you haven't joined us before, as I said, my name is Stacy Pendarvis. I'm the Vice President of Programs at MBF. And our sole mission is to provide prevention education for children through evidence-based and evidence-informed programs. So today's topic is super important to us because we really believe strongly in what the research tells us works to protect kids. But we have comprehensive programs that cover bullying, cyberbullying, all four types of abuse, digital safety, exploitation, trafficking, and in the older grades, also relationship abuse. If you have not joined us before, welcome. And we're extremely thrilled for today's webinar. So let me just get started with a couple of things. As we're going through the presentation, if you want to type any questions you may have in the Q&A box, we will kind of hold those and at the end have Dr. Bright address those. So let me go ahead and introduce you to our speaker today, Dr. Melissa Bright. Dr. Bright's multidisciplinary research focus is on family violence and related social determinants of health and development. Dr. Bright's educational background is in developmental psychology with an emphasis on early childhood development and health, and her research program has progressed from the examination of the development of the stress response system in infancy and toddlerhood to identifying health and developmental outcomes associated with stress and adversity in childhood, to identifying intergenerational patterns of abuse and neglect, to working toward designing interventions for identifying and addressing maltreatment in prenatal and primary pediatric care. Her newest faculty appointments with the Department of Obstetrics and Gynecology within the UF College of Medicine uniquely positions her to conduct clinical and translational research in, I think I just read that, prenatal and pediatric care. She has extensive experience building cohorts for longitudinal examination, including transient and difficult to follow participants. Dr. Bright leverages a strong and interdisciplinary network of collaborators with expertise in clinical care, working with high-risk maternal infant dyads and implementation science. Her end goal is to conduct rigorous research to utilize the data to support change in practice, to improve outcomes for women and their young children. Her work has been supported by private foundations, a maternal and child health work group grant, new investigator grants from both the American Psychosomatic Society and Academy Health, a research grant from PsyChi, and a graduate research fellowship from the National Science Foundation. And of course, she also leads the research team along with David Finkelhor, who presented for us a couple of weeks ago during this series, who have completed 2 randomized controlled trials evaluating our MBF Child Safety Matters program, and now they are working on the MBF Teen Safety Matters program evaluation. So, and let me just add, at MBF, we feel very blessed to have Dr. Bright and Dr. Finkelhor as our main researchers. And we're grateful to have her here with us today to share her expertise and knowledge. So thank you, Dr. Bright, for being here, and I will turn the presentation over to you so you can get started.
Thank you, Stacy. Hoping everyone can see me, and I'm going to just start my presentation. So, as Stacy said, if you have questions, please put them in the chat box. I really encourage them. I prefer to talk with people than at people, and so I'm going to give some high-level summaries of things. Just because I don't know exactly what your background is and what you'd like to know, and I'd like to tailor it to something that's relevant to the audience. So please put your questions in there, and we'll spend a good deal of time at the end kind of diving into whatever you'd like to hear about. So as Stacy said, I'm a faculty member at the University of Florida. My primary appointments are in obstetrics and gynecology and pediatrics, but I am a developmental scientist. I've been trained only in research. I'm not a clinician, and I really get a unique role, or have a unique role, in being able to conduct research in those 2 clinical departments, and then also in the community, really focusing on the lifespan from conception to, I guess not the full lifespan, but to adolescence, and thinking about how to prevent family violence. And I've done a lot of different types of work, focusing on women, focusing on pregnant women, focusing on children, school systems, clinics, etc. I really love that work. So I'm excited to be able to present some of that to you today. The title of my talk is The Science of Preventing Maltreatment. I just want to clarify that really I'm talking about adult to child maltreatment. So that's your physical, sexual, and emotional abuse, and then physical and emotional neglect. There are all sorts of other types of child victimization, like bullying and human trafficking, that really could have their own presentation. So the data that I'm going to talk about today are just focused on those first ones that I mentioned. So I have sort of 4 broad topics that I thought would be relevant for today. The first is why prevention is better than intervention, how you can be a critical consumer of prevention research to decide what's good and what's maybe not so good, what types of prevention programs and policies exist and do they work. And I just want to launch a quick poll to get everyone's opinion on which of these is most interesting to you. And that way I can spend a little bit more time on that topic and then also kind of focus maybe our discussion at the end. So I'll give you a few minutes to complete the poll. Looks like we have about 75% completed. A few more of you chiming in. Looks like about a tie between why prevention is better than intervention. Almost there, a few more people. All right, I'm gonna go ahead and end it there at 82%. And just let you guys know, so it looks like almost a tie between why prevention is better than intervention and what programs exist. So I'll try to spend a little bit more time on those 2 topics, and certainly we can tailor our questions at the end for that. Thank you everyone for doing that. So why prevention is better than intervention? So we know that across the lifespan, we really are seeing the greatest amount of brain development in the first 3 years in particular, but even up to the first 11 years. And by growth, it's not the physical size of the brain, it's the connections within the brain, and it's the connections in specific areas with specific functions. So we can actually track from 0 to 5 years areas like the sensory areas for hearing and vision, and then the motor areas for walking and talking and dexterity. We can see when they kind of peak in terms of their connections being made. And when that happens, we are most susceptible to the environmental input that's coming in. So you may have heard of some research where if a child were somehow to never be spoken to during a certain window of their development, they wouldn't get those skills. Their hearing wouldn't develop because as the brain is making those connections, it's not getting the input from the environment that it needs to be able to learn those skills. And so we call them sensitive periods. And again, 0 to 5 is really when we have the most sensitive periods for the most skill development. But that's continuing through elementary school as well. Then we also know that, unfortunately, this time is the peak time for child maltreatment. So infants less than a year have the highest rate of maltreatment. And then kids from 0 to 5 and 0 to 11 have the highest percentage of victimization. And probably many of you know that a lot of that is because, first of all, kids are really stressful. They are really taxing. And if you have other sort of stressors in your life, then having a child is kind of just icing on the cake. And also children very young can't disclose, report, or stop. And so they make for easy targets. So combining those, we have our sort of brain development happening during this time, really peaking. That's when we're experiencing all this maltreatment, and the maltreatment can cause what's called toxic stress. So being a little bit stressed is okay and actually good for our bodies. We see the hormone cortisol is what gets released when we're stressed out. And it's actually really good if we were, let's say, about to be attacked by a bear, then our bodies get ready to run and it mobilizes us and we're ready to sort of act whatever we need to do. And that's good for a peak time. Or like if we're taking an exam or giving a presentation to 300 people, you know, our body sort of gets us ready, sort of you focus, you're thinking, very attentive, and your body's sort of in overdrive at that moment. And then when the event is over, you come back to normal and your body is more relaxed and we drop those cortisol levels. But when we see kids who are being abused chronically, those levels are peaking all the time because I'm always not sure what's going to happen. I don't know when I see my father or mother or uncle, I don't know what they're going to do. I can no longer predict that. And so I'm constantly on edge wondering, am I going to make them mad today? Or have they had too much to drink today? Or, you know, this behavior made them mad yesterday, but I don't know if it will today. And so that constant flooding of hormone and some other, or cortisol and some other hormones are really being deleterious to the brain during really sensitive times. So unfortunately, from that, we see a lot of ailments and illnesses from kids who have a history of maltreatment. And some of these are physical. So we know that we see stomach aches and headaches. They're more likely to get diseases that cause inflammation or are from a suppressed immune system, things like asthma, allergies. We're also more likely to see bone injuries from direct physical abuse, but we're also more likely to see things like anxiety, depression, behavioral outbursts, sort of unpredictable behavior, inconsistent behavior, and also developmental and learning outcomes too, like difficulty learning to read, being behind their classmates in academic progress. And so we really see it across the board. And actually, we've had some research in the past 10 years that shows us these things last across the lifetime and actually decrease our lifespan. So adults who report a history of maltreatment and other adversities actually don't live as long as their peers who don't report those experiences. So if you're not sold on just the humanity part of it's bad for the individual, it's also really bad for the community and society and economy. So we see that the lifetime cost of a child who doesn't die from their maltreatment is about $210,000 onto society. And that's going to be things like public services for mental health, for physical health, ED visits, losing work productivity, possibly jail time, anything that society might have to contribute to that person. If the child should die, we see that number jump up to over $1 million. And that's because we lose all that work productivity. So that child that could have grown up and be a contributory member of society now no longer is, and so we're losing all of that in our economy. And when you combine all those together, we see that the actual lifetime cost of all the victims of maltreatment is over $124 billion, which is really just outstanding to think about. I want to sort of go over this slide. So on the x-axis, you have essentially age from birth all the way through adulthood. And this is where we can implement various prevention and intervention programs. So if you think about some programs at birth, it might be like home visiting programs, nurse partnerships. You think about school programs, so school-based prevention, similar to what Monique Burr Foundation offers, high school sex education, and then job training for people who might struggle to either find a job or have the right skills. And on the y-axis, we have the return on investment. So if we start to, or if we provide money into programs to support those things, so the home visiting, the prevention programs, etc., what economist James Heckman has modeled and colleagues is this return on investment model based on when we implement that program. And what we're seeing is that we get our greatest return on investment when we implement early, which sounds super intuitive, but as soon as you add numbers and science to it, everyone's a little bit more convinced. And then as you put money into later programs, we really don't see the return. So we might keep someone out of jail that saves us some money, or we might get someone out of Section 8 housing that saves us some money, but not nearly as much as if we were to implement the programs in that, say, birth to age 5 time, when if we could do some quality early child care programs, again, home visiting, parenting education, all of that, then we're really going to see the outcomes be worth the investment. I encourage anyone to go and read about Heckman's work. It's really fascinating. I'll try to slow down a bit. I realize I'm kind of speeding through some of these slides. So that's really why prevention is better than intervention, because if we get ahead of it, then we're more likely to stop before it happens, which is the notion of prevention, and then also to save us a lot of money and to be more efficient with the money that we do spend. So I want to talk a little bit about how to be a critical consumer of prevention research. And I wanted to put this in because I believe that a lot of our attendees are probably not researchers by nature. You're practitioners, you're boots on the ground, you're actually implementing what the science says, and you probably or might be overwhelmed by the options available to you and phrases like evidence-based and data-driven and you know, this is based on research and science, etc. But how do you really know? So I wanted to give you a few tools to be better consumers of that information. So when you're looking at a program or a policy, you want to make sure that it's been evaluated or implemented with some sort of research framework. So you want that evaluation to be from not the person who created the program or policy. So when we see government policies go into place, they often will require external evaluation. And so there's a contract that'll go out, and usually someone at a university will pick up the contract and do an evaluation to see if the government program is actually working. Same thing for private foundations or organizations who create programs, who want to say, you know, our program is effective. They should really seek out someone who has no vested interest in the program to evaluate it more objectively. So that's one thing to look for. The next is to consider the evaluation that's done in the program. What level of population are they targeting? So there are 3 tiers At the bottom, a program might target the entire population. So everyone is eligible, everyone should be affected by this. It should benefit everyone. And that's really, it's called universal or primary prevention. The next tier is more specific. So you might sort of target your policy or program towards the people that you think might need it the most, or that have gone through some level of screening to determine they're at higher risk than the entire population. So a lot of our laws are going to be universal because they don't just apply to some people. So they'll be in the primary prevention area. But the second tier might be something like, we want to target families who are in certain neighborhoods that we know have high rates of maltreatment, or families who have a prior history with child protection services. Even though there's nothing suspected currently, they're at higher risk for seeing that again. So they might be in our second tier. And then our third tier is very targeted, very specific, and they are more interventions than preventions because we know that they're at risk, we know that they need help, and this is going to only be for a certain group of people. So if the program is for past perpetrators of child abuse or child sexual abuse, because we know that they've perpetrated before and they need very specific programming on avoiding recidivism and learning about their behavior and their past that might have brought them to that behavior, etc. So you want to look to see what level the program that you're thinking about is targeting. And also, what did their evaluation or examination of that program, did they select participants that match what they say the program should target? So if it is supposed to be a universal program that is good for everyone, but they only used low-income families from a certain zip code who had a past history, then they really didn't assess the universality of that program. We don't know if it would be good for everyone. We know maybe it would be good for that specific group. Randomization. So I think a lot of people are familiar with the term randomized control trial, or RCT, control groups, treatment groups, intervention groups. And these are really all pointing to the same kind of idea of the gold standard of science of including randomization. And the reason that you do randomization is because you want everyone in your participant pool to have an equal opportunity for the treatment or intervention. And that way you know that your two groups are equal, and that you don't have some bias in the groups that selected to be in the intervention versus didn't, selected to opt out of it. Because there very well could be something about those two groups of people that makes them different on your outcome measure. And so when possible, you absolutely want to randomize. And when you're doing something like a treatment program or prevention program randomization, that's very possible. You know, if we want to talk about what are the effects of maltreatment on mental health, we could never randomize some children to be abused and other children not. So sometimes it just won't work. But when possible, you always want to randomize. Measurement. So the entire evaluation or study is dead in the water if the measurement is not good. And the measurement needs to be, you might have heard the words reliable and valid, meaning we want to be able to measure the same thing consistently, and we want it to actually measure what we think we're measuring. Most research on child abuse prevention that, actually I think I could say just most research, looks at changes in things like knowledge and attitudes about maltreatment and victimization. So there's a few measures in the literature that include those things, and they were created a long time ago, and they're kind of just universally accepted. Doesn't actually mean they're very good measures, and doesn't actually mean that they measure the knowledge or attitudes at all. Just kind of, that's all we have, so that's what we use. But when you are reading about an evaluation, you want to look at what measure are they using, and what did the pre-test scores look like. So a lot of times with these measures, it's very difficult to get variability in the baseline. So if you're looking at something like knowledge and 90% of your participants score very high at baseline, there's nowhere for them to change. There's nowhere for them to grow or to see improvement in post-testing. And so that's a bad measure. You should see sort of some people scoring very low, some people scoring very high, and everyone else kind of distributed in the middle. So that's one thing to look for. Another thing is at the post-test, you should also see that variability. So if everyone sort of jumps to 100%, that sounds like a great program, but it's not showing any variability, which we expect in populations. Also, the measurement, think critically about whether or not it's meaningful. So again, like I said, most studies look at knowledge and attitudes, and I absolutely have used those in studies, and I think they are valuable. But do we think that changing our knowledge or attitudes about abuse actually changes our risk for perpetrating or being a victim? And honestly, to date, I really don't have the research to support that. There are certainly theoretical models to show that your knowledge, your attitudes, your intention, your perceptions, all these variables are predictive of your behavior. But I think in a review of maybe 50 studies or something that came out recently, only 1 or 2 of them actually looked at the victimization behavior, and the results were inconclusive. And so when you're going to pour money into a program, and then maybe you might be a consumer of that program, you really want it to have whatever long-term effect you think it's supposed to have. Just these short-term effects are not good enough, in my opinion. So a really good evaluation is going to dig very deep and see what is the long-term goal of this program or policy, and are we actually getting there? And we can get all the short-term goals, but we really need to be focusing on what's that long-term outcome we're trying to achieve. Which brings me to long-term assessments. So a lot of evaluations are going to be pre and post. The day that we give the program, we're going to give a survey in the morning, and then the next day when we finish the program, we're going to give a survey in the afternoon. That's our pre and post. That measures our ability to regurgitate what someone told us a couple hours ago. That really does not measure our learning, doesn't measure knowledge acquisition. It measures like short-term memory. So you want some assessments that are far enough away from the material or the program or whatever was implemented, like weeks or months, and then also very long term. So if you're thinking that your program or a certain policy is going to change our rates of abuse for years, then you need to measure it at years. So we need to know in 6 to 8 months, do people retain this knowledge? Are they still using it, or have they gone back to what they knew before? Changing someone's behavior, especially parenting behavior, is very, very difficult. And so to assume that, you know, the day after we finished our behavioral intervention, you know, parents are all of a sudden using the right forms of discipline or better forms of discipline, they must do that forever, you know, after that, is probably not true. So checking in longer term than just the day after or 6 months later. And then finally, once the evaluation or study has been done, it needs to undergo peer review. So we talked about the importance of external evaluation, and that's getting someone who doesn't have an inherent bias for the creator of the policy or program. And then we need to take another step out so that other scientists with expertise in the topic can look at it and say, okay, yes, they did a good job selecting their sample, doing their measurements, their design is good. We as a scientific community support this. And so that's how you get into published journals that are behind a paywall most of the time, which is an important, different topic for another day. But if the policy or program can show, look, we've undergone peer review of our evaluation, that's another level of sort of confidence you can have in that evaluation. So what types of programs exist? So my goal isn't to kind of list every program, but I wanted to give you some context of the different nature of programs and how to determine what might be useful for you or what we're lacking in science. So some programs target the child directly. So this is going to be things like Second Step, the Monique Burr Foundation's Child Safety Matters, Safer Smarter Kids, the YWCA has some, and again, this is not an exhaustive list. And by target the child, I mean they are trying to equip the child with some knowledge or skills to either prevent the victimization or disclose the victimization. And they're really trying to do this kind of endogenous process or create this endogenous process. Other programs target a second level, like the parents, the family. So things like the Purple Crying program, teaching about safe sleep, teaching about when infants cry, or when absolutely infants cry, how to deal with that if it's overwhelming, how to know if there's a problem versus you can just put them down and sort of walk away safely. There's a safe care, parent training, home visiting program, family preservation programs, things that really are targeting either the whole family or at least the parents of the child and giving them skills and knowledge. The next level is thinking about the community or agencies in the community. So as I mentioned earlier, some of my work is in clinical care, pediatrics and prenatal care. And there's a couple of tools to teach physicians how to identify and address potential maltreatment or current maltreatment, like the Safe Environment for Every Kid. There's other programs from popular agencies like Darkness to Light. There's Stewards of Children, which they target adults who work with children who are not necessarily their parents, although they could be. These are teachers, they are principals, they're coaches. And then something like Circles of Safety, same thing. So they are targeting people who work with children. And then also things like media campaigns, things that go out to the general population or the general community to try and affect change at a higher level that they expect will trickle down to the child. And then finally, at the highest level is more of a population level approach. So laws and policies, and some are directly relevant, like CAPTA, which is the Child Abuse Protection, I'm gonna get this wrong, maybe it's Treatment Act of 74, 76. I'm sure someone on this call knows and will correct me. Aaron's Law, which you might be familiar with, is a law that mandates child sexual abuse education for K through 12. And so some states have passed it and some states haven't. Safe haven laws. So having an opportunity for parents to drop off their child at certain locations, usually hospitals, fire stations, within, I think, the first 30 days of life with no questions asked. And so the idea being that if we have these laws in place, we will see lower rates of victimization because people have options and they have education. And then also laws that might not make direct sense, but actually we do see some effect. So things like economic policies, so economic assistance policies, the SNAP program, which is the food assistance program, and actually something like gasoline prices. We see that when some of these things fluctuate or when they're different between states, we see differences in rates, which is really interesting. To think about how we could make a change at such a high level to affect an entire population of kids, whether it be within the state or the whole nation. And this is sort of something that I'm starting to dabble in with some students of mine, and we're finding some really interesting things that I'm going to share with you today. Okay, do these programs work? I realize this is a pretty intense question, I guess, that I can't answer the question for all of them. You know, you can go back and see if any of these things have been systematically evaluated. Just because they say they're evidence-based, that might mean that they were created based on what the science tells us, but doesn't mean that they have actually been determined to be effective. But my group, with Dr. Finkelhor and with a couple of other colleagues, had started to examine some of these things, and we have found what I think are really interesting findings. I'm just going to share a few of those studies with you. So the first one we did about 4 or 5 years ago, maybe now. It was actually the Child Safety Matters program. And we conducted an evaluation in the state of Florida. We had, I believe, 12 schools on board, and we had about 1,000 children in grades kindergarten through 5th grade. So they were aged about 5 through 12. We did a pretest assessment of their knowledge, and we'd worked really hard on that measurement to make sure we had good variability in the beginning. And then we had the counselors implement the program per standard of care, business as usual. And that happens over about a month. And then we came back about a month to 6 weeks later and did a post-test. And we had randomization. So half of our kids got the program early in the school year, and then half of our kids got the program after we had done post-testing. And what we found is that the kids were able to increase their knowledge about a month later, which is fantastic, but also as a true researcher, I was a skeptic to say, it's kind of learning, you know, that's kind of memory. So then we actually waited and came back 7 months later, and for the vast majority of those students, they had moved on to the next grade. So we're talking from, you know, about February, March until September, October of the following year, or that year, which to me was a lot of opportunity for unlearning the material, but also being exposed to a lot of different experiences, context, etc., that would affect their ability to recall that programming. And actually we found that the effects were maintained. I think I have a graph. Okay, so our gray here is our treatment condition. They received the program, and our white is our control, with our y-axis being the percent correct and x-axis being the timing that we did it. So as you can see, they started about equal at the beginning, which is what you want. You want everyone to be about the same. And then our treatment group went up and stayed up over time. And again, I'm a really skeptic researcher, and these were impressive findings to me. So then after we did that, we really got to thinking, our youngest participants are in kindergarten, and I was in the classroom working with them on some of these measures. They really struggled to understand the questions and the concepts. It's very difficult to explain to a 5-year-old that it's not okay for an adult to hit you, but then at home, if they're being spanked or using corporal punishment, it's not illegal in a lot of states, in a lot of places, and particularly some of the places that we were doing the research. It's very encouraged and totally socially normative. And so to try to teach this kind of double standard topic, or something like secrets versus surprises, and saying, you shouldn't be, if a teacher gives you extra special attention, that might not be good. However, teachers do give special attention when they see a student who might be struggling or doing excellent, maybe made great progress. They want to reach out and say, you did great. Here's an extra book, or here's an extra bookmark, or whatever. And so we doubted how much the youngest children could learn these concepts. And then we also suspected that the number of times that we introduced the material would make a difference, but we just wanted to add some science to it. And really what we found is that the young children, so we did just kindergarten through 2nd graders, they were able to learn it as well. And sort of consistent with what we believed, the more sessions that they had that were shorter, they actually did better. So I think I have a graph on this too. Yeah, so we just did, again, we randomized, and we did a pre and post implementation, our post being, I think it was about 6 weeks after they'd received the material. So our diagonal line group here is the control group. The gray is the group that received the material in 2 lessons. And then the darker gray is they received it in 4 lessons. So again, as a critical consumer of research, you see that everyone kind of starts around the 60%. That means we have about the same distribution of knowledge in those 3 groups. They were then randomized, and then we see the higher levels in the group that got the 4 lessons sometime later. Another study that became way more famous than I ever thought it would is called the report card study. And I work with a pediatrician in Florida who is actually a child protection team director, and he's considered a child abuse pediatrician, meaning he has expertise in investigating child abuse. And he told me one time, we were brainstorming some topics, he said, we see a lot more cases after the report cards come out. And I said, maybe you do, maybe you're just biased. And I talked to some educator friends of mine and some teachers who said, oh, we hate giving out report cards. We know for some kids it's not going to be good. And I said, okay, you might be biased. Humans are always biased. And so I said, let's put some numbers to this. So I got a team together, and we actually pulled all of the dates of report card release for an academic year in every single county in the state of Florida. And we then looked at the child abuse hotline calls for all types of abuse and all levels of outcome. So if they were verified or not substantiated, no indicator, etc. And we just pulled out the cases that were verified physical abuse. So this is going to be your most extreme of cases, because to verify physical abuse, especially if it's something like that comes from a spanking, can be quite difficult a few days later once we get an investigation going. So I tried to be as conservative as possible to really determine if this effect was there. And lo and behold, we found it. So we found that the incidence rate of verified physical abuse on a Saturday is 300% higher when the report card is released on a Friday. We did not find the effect at any other day of the week. So if the report card is released on Monday, the Tuesday rate is about the same as if the report card is released on Wednesday to the Thursday rate, etc. It's only this weekend effect. And there's all sorts of possible explanations that we can't dig out of our current study. It's not in the data. Things about like increased substance use on the weekends, or you know, we might expect actually the number to be lower because less exposure to mandated reporters. It might be that parents feel like they have more opportunity to punish when they have a few days before the child will go back. All sorts of possibilities, but we really did find the effect, which tells us that there's an opportunity to change policy here. So it's, if we can replicate this effect and dig into a little deeper of why it's there, then maybe we need to be changing the policy of when report cards are being released. So to give you a context for numbers, in a state like Florida with a population of about, what is it, 3 million kids? Yeah, it could be the difference between 19 cases of abuse on a Saturday versus 5. So quite a big difference. And just to be sensitive of time, a couple more things that we've just dug into, and you guys really are getting hot off the press because we just found these effects this week, but I'm so excited that I wanted to share it with people. So I had a group of students who dug into state policies around abuse prevention, and then also various economic policies. And then we looked at all the rates of abuse across the US, and we looked at sexual abuse specifically. And we found that states with legislation that mandate K through 12 sexual abuse prevention have higher rates of sexual abuse. I'll show you this in a graph. So that's these green ones. So these states have laws mandating. These states have laws, the yellow, who encourage, and then orange is maybe they've gone back and forth on the legislation, and then red is they have no legislation. So instant kind of reaction is like, oh, well, that's bad, right? Like, why would we want higher rates? But we don't have causation here. So an alternative explanation is that when they mandate legislation, children feel more educated and empowered to report and disclose. So when they are being taught what is okay and not okay, they are more likely to report what is not okay than if they don't have any education on that. Some states actually differentiate who should also receive education, not just the students, but parents, teachers, and other school personnel. And same thing, higher rates when these people are recommended for education. And again, I think education empowers and provides knowledge that people then feel more comfortable reporting. And the last one I want to share with you is statute of limitations. So this is statutes on civil cases of child sexual abuse. And some states have no statute, so it means there's no limit on the amount of time that someone can file a charge for a perpetrator. And other states, most other states, have some time limit between, you know, it's like, I think 1 year after age 18 up to like 50 years or something. And similarly, we found that the states that have no limit, means you can tell at any point and you can pursue it, have much higher rates, which I think is consistent with the education side of states that build a culture of disclosure and acceptability of disclosure tend to see their higher rates. Okay, so I will end it there so we have some time for questions.
Thank you so much, Melissa. I'm going to take over the screen share from you, and we'll get started with a few questions. That was great. We do have quite a few questions, so let me pull those over here and we'll get started. Just to go ahead and clarify, one question was with what you were talking about with the higher rates. Are those reported rates? Yeah.
Yep. Those are agency reported rates.
Okay, so got another clarifying question. Did you say 0 to 1 has the highest level of maltreatment and ages 5 to 11 the highest rates of victimization?
Yeah, so I use those terms interchangeably, maltreatment and victimization. Infants have the highest rate. So of 1,000 infants, I don't want to give the exact number, but we could say it's 10, versus kids age 2 to 5, it might be like 3 of every 1,000. And then overall, 0 to 5 is the greatest percentage. Like half of all victims are 0 to 5.
Gotcha. So another question, do children who experience unsafe households growing up mature quicker because they have to be more alert or aware of the adult's behavior around them?
So mature is a difficult thing to measure, but certainly we do see differences in kids in terms of their behavior when they grow up in stressful households. And sometimes they take on more responsibility than others. Whether or not they're really ready for that responsibility is still questionable. They don't have more advanced brains. They don't have necessarily more skills, but they are forced a lot of times to learn quickly on their feet and just survive.
Got it. Someone asks, how do we convey the message of prevention to our legislators in order to get them to invest more funding so that we're more proactive rather than reactive?
Oh, $1 million question, right? So I would think that everything I presented here today would sell every senator and congressman immediately to invest, and it still doesn't happen. I think that we have to convince them of the importance of prevention versus intervention, and one of the best ways, I think, is the economic angle. So even if you don't, necessarily believe that there's all these negative outcomes for the individual, we definitely can demonstrate the economic impact. So if we can put in quality education early on, then we won't have to pay for as much Medicaid later on. We won't have to pay for prisons. We won't have to pay for ED visits for people who don't have health insurance. We won't have to pay for government subsidized mental health care, because we will have prevented all of those things. And unfortunately, it can take a while to show that, to convince someone to give us money now so that in 20 years we don't have to pay. But if we look back at the data from the past 20 years, we can absolutely demonstrate that pattern. So that's my best angle for any legislator, but often question why they don't get it. I don't know.
Yeah, I'm right there with you. We struggle with that continuously, as do I think, everybody who's probably on this call from child advocacy centers and schools and other youth serving organizations. It's a constant struggle. Someone asked, in these studies, what were the control groups measuring? Did the children not receive the prevention programs?
Yes, so so everyone starts the same. So all the kids are kind of in the same pot at one time. They all get the same measurement. And then the control group kind of, let's say they're in different classrooms or different schools, they just go about their normal business for however many months, while the treatment group gets the programming. And then once we do our post-testing, maybe 6 weeks after that, everyone gets the post-test again. So the control groups are going to see this survey again, but they haven't had any programming yet. And then after we do that, we offer the programming because we believe the programming is effective. I mean, that study is, or those studies are supposed to tell us that, but if we go in believing we think this is a good program, then we are just ethically obligated to provide it to the control kids too. They just get it after we've measured the effect.
Have there been any studies done on the relationship between prevention programs for younger children and rates of trafficking?
I'm going to say no, because most prevention programming focuses on child sexual abuse, the ones that target children. Most are school-based. Most are ages like 8 to 11 or 12. And the incidence rate of human trafficking, although it is higher than we ever previously thought, is actually still quite low. And so in order to see an effect, we would have to include hundreds of thousands of kids in our sample to be able to see a difference. Not to say we shouldn't study it, but that I'm guessing has not been done. I've never read a study about that.
Yeah. Well, I remember when we were developing middle and high school and talking with Dr. Finkelhor about the trafficking content and what it needed to say and what it needed to include. It's really hard to know what best practices are for that topic because we don't have that research to tell us what we need to teach them. I mean, we know we need to teach them about, you know, red flag indicators, grooming, manipulation tactics, things like that, where they're likely to be targeted and all. But so I think that's an area that's ripe for a lot of research. Here's one about your report card study. When report cards are mailed on Monday instead of Friday and abuse stats are less, do you think it's because parents are more aware that abuse would be more obvious if the children had school the next day?
Yeah, so that's one of our hypotheses. Unfortunately, we can't dig that deep and get that specific of an answer with the data that we have, but that was one of the ideas, was that, you know, parents are getting this report card on a Friday, and they may not be very consciously thinking, okay, well, I have 1-2 days, so if I do this, etc. But it might be more of a, you know, this is the weekend, things kind of go a little more how we want at home, as opposed to thinking about, well, he's going to be back in school in 8 hours, so, you know, I don't want my kid to say something. So yes, that's a hypothesis, but we don't know yet.
Let's see how much time we have. We're almost out of time, actually. I'll ask you one last question. Does that mean that using the 4-lesson program instead of the 2-lesson program would be more beneficial since they have more lessons and are shorter?
It does show an effect in that way. It's not, we also see the effect with 2 lessons. So they still are learning with 2 lessons. In general, education of any sort is going to be better the more you can offer it. That's why we don't do just, you know, 1 hour of math a week, right? It's like every day we need to do math homework through the entire year, because the more we can offer this information and answer questions, clarify, expand, the more someone's going to learn. Trying to get a school to implement content like this any more than twice is very difficult, much less every week. You know, that would be ideal, right? And so, yes, I would say gold standard is 4 times, 6 times, 8 times, however many times you can get it in there. But we do know that 2 times is still effective.
Yeah, and you know, that's something that we learned. You know, obviously we know what the best practices are for prevention education, but there also has to be a line between what's practical for the setting that you're trying to implement it in. And we have some schools that struggle even to get into a classroom twice because the teachers don't want to teach it, so the school counselors teach it, but they have so many other duties. So it's really kind of walking a balancing line. So that's interesting. But I do want to share, if we didn't get to your question, Dr. Bright has graciously given her email address. You can email her directly and she will answer your questions. And look online and learn more about our programs. You know, I always remember when we first met with David Finkelhor and Dr. Bright, one of the questions that they asked us was, what are you going to do if the study comes back and says it doesn't work, that the kids don't learn it, they don't retain it? And we said, then you guys are going to tell us how to fix it, because our goal is to have a program that works. And, you know, we hope that by investing in research, we tell people all the time, there are a lot of great programs out there that don't have the level of research and evidence that we do. We've been very fortunate to be able to invest in it because it's a very lengthy and costly process. But we're committed to that process. As I said at the outset, Dr. Bright and the whole team we've now moved to the middle school program, and we're evaluating that. So, and I will end just by thanking Dr. Bright once again for her time and expertise and ongoing support for research and providing the best evidence-based programs that we can provide. And thank you all for attending, and hopefully we will see you again next week. Bye. Have a good day, everybody. Thank you.